The porch light was off. I noticed that first, before I even cut the engine standing at the edge of the driveway. Engine still ticking. 3:41 in the morning. The house was dark, except for a thin line of light under the front door, the kind that comes from a television left on in another room. Ryan's car was parked at an angle in the driveway, the front left tire riding up onto the grass. Not the way a man parks who expects to move the car in the morning, the way a man parks who came home fast and didn't think about it. I had driven 47 miles in 53 minutes. I knew the exact distance because I'd made that drive every Thanksgiving and every Christmas for 4 years. And I had clocked it the first time out of old habit, the kind that doesn't leave you after 31 years of insurance investigation. You measure things. You note them. You don't always know why until later. The call had come at 3:02. 40 seconds. Total. I had been awake already, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched, the way I sometimes sit at night when sleep doesn't come easily and I don't want to force it. My phone was face up on the table. When it lit up with Callie's name, I picked it up before the first ring finished. She said, "Dad." Then she said the address, her own address, as if I might have forgotten it, as if she needed to be certain I understood exactly where she was. Then she said, "Don't tell him you're coming." And then there was a sound. I'm not going to describe the sound. I will say that I was already standing up when the call ended, and I was in the car 40 seconds after that. Before I got out of the car, I touched the watch on my left wrist. My wife Ellen's watch, a small silver thing she wore every day for 22 years. The crystal scratched at the 4 o'clock position from a fall she took in the garden the summer before she got sick. I've worn it on my own wrist for 6 years. I touched it once, the way I sometimes do without thinking about it, and then I got out of the car and walked to the front door. I rang the bell. From inside, I heard footsteps heavy, unhurried, not the footsteps of someone who had been awake, the footsteps of someone being pulled up from sleep, moving on instinct, not yet thinking about who might be standing outside at this hour. Ryan opened the door, gray t-shirt, hair flat on the left side, eyes not fully focused. He was 36 years old, and he looked, in that moment, younger the way people look when sleep strips away the version of themselves they've chosen to present. He looked at me, and the color left his face the way water leaves a glass when you tip it not all at once, but completely until there was nothing left. His mouth opened, then closed. His hand tightened on the doorframe. I didn't say anything. I've learned, over 31 years of sitting across from people who had things to hide, that silence is a more efficient tool than most questions. I stood on the porch, and I waited. The night was cold and very still. A dog barked somewhere down the street twice, and then stopped. Ryan spoke first. "She's fine," he said. "She's sleeping." I looked past his shoulder into the dark house, the thin line of light under the interior door, the angle of his body in the door frame not quite blocking, but not quite opening either. "Then wake her up," I said. "I want to tell you how I got to that doorstep. It starts 6 months earlier, with a phone call I should have answered differently. My wife, Ellen, used to say I trusted too slowly and forgave too quickly. She said it the way she said most things without accusation, just as a fact she had observed over 26 years of living with me. She died 11 years ago, in the back bedroom of the house on Carver Street, on a Tuesday morning in October when the light through the curtains was the color of old paper. I've thought about what she said many times since then. I thought about it the night Callie first brought Ryan home. That was 18 months before the wedding. I'd made pot roast because Callie had asked me to, and because pot roast was the meal she had always requested when she wanted something to go well. She was 27 years old, and she still believed in the ritual of it. I didn't tell her I found that endearing. I just made the pot roast. Ryan Mercer shook my hand at the door with the kind of grip that communicates awareness firm enough to mean something, not so firm as to mean too much. He was 34 then, dark-haired, with a face that was pleasant without being remarkable. He asked about my work inside of the first 10 minutes, and the way he asked it was not the way most people ask, which is to say, He did not ask and then wait politely to redirect the conversation back to himself. He asked and then listened. He said his father had spent 30 years as a financial advisor in Cleveland. He said, "You must have seen some things. In 31 years of insurance investigation." I told him I had. He said, "I imagine most people don't realize how much they reveal when they think no one is paying attention." I told him that was exactly right. I liked him for saying it. I believed most of what Ryan Mercer told me for approximately 8 months after that dinner. And I want to be precise about that number because it matters later. The wedding was in June of the following year, a Saturday, at a venue outside the city with a garden that Callie had wanted since she was a teenager. I had offered to pay for a prenuptial agreement 6 weeks before the ceremony, not as a challenge to Ryan, I told her, but as a standard instrument. I had seen enough in 31 years to know what the absence of one looks like 2 years into a marriage. Callie laughed. She called me paranoid. It was the first time she used that word for me, though not the last. She said Ryan wasn't like that, and I told her I believed her, and I did not press the matter further. What I did instead, without telling Callie, was call my attorney. Diane Cho had handled my affairs for 9 years, at that point a careful, precise woman who had once told me that the most important legal documents are the ones that never need to be used. I had her establish a trust. It held the property on Carver Street, Ellen's jewelry, and the $214,000 that remained from Ellen's life insurance settlement, the money I had never touched because it had never felt like mine to spend. The trust required my signature and Callie's to transfer or liquidate any asset. Ryan's name was not on it and could not be added without both of us present and consenting. I did not tell Callie about the trust. I told myself I would tell her when the time was right, and I went on telling myself that for longer than I should have. I also bought her a phone, a prepaid device, the inexpensive kind you find near the register at a pharmacy. I told her it was for emergencies, in case her regular phone died or was lost. She took it with the same laugh she had given the prenuptial agreement. "Paranoid," she said again, and kissed my cheek and put the phone in her purse. I watched her put it there and said nothing else about it. The first 6 months of the marriage appeared normal. Ryan and Callie had bought a house in the Weston Park neighborhood, 3 bedrooms, a corner lot, a mortgage that was within their combined income but not comfortably. Ryan's financial consulting practice was doing well, he said. Callie was working as a project coordinator for an architectural firm downtown. When I called on Sundays, she answered, and we talked about ordinary things. I noticed, gradually, that the calls became shorter, not dramatically, not in a way that would register as a clear signal to anyone who wasn't paying attention. But I had spent 31 years paying attention to the gap between what people said and what the evidence suggested, and the gap was there. She sounded tired in a way that was different from work tired. Work tired has a particular quality. There is still engagement underneath it, still the shape of a person who is present in their own life. What I was hearing was something quieter than that. I did not say this to Callie. I did not say it to Ryan. I noted it the same way I had noted thousands of small discrepancies over 3 decades of investigation without conclusion, without action, as a data point waiting for context. Ryan had a reasonable explanation for everything, which is a thing I had also encountered before. When I mentioned carefully that Callie seemed worn down, he said she was adjusting to married life, that the first year was always an adjustment, that she was fine. He said it without irritation, which I noted. Irritation would have been a signal. His calmness was harder to read. When I suggested that it might be worth Callie having a full physical with Dr. Elaine Marsh, who had been Callie's doctor since she was 9 years old, who knew her baseline the way few people do, Ryan smiled and said, "She has her own doctor now. Raymond, she's fine." He said it gently. He said it the way you speak to someone whose concern you respect, but whose judgment you do not share. I did not argue with him. I said, of course, and I meant it to sound like agreement, and it apparently did. That evening, I called Dr. Marsh. I told her about the conversation. I told her I had no clinical basis for concern, only an observational one, and that I understood she could not share medical information without Callie's consent. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "Raymond, I haven't seen Callie in 14 months." I told her I understood. She said she would note the call in her records. I thanked her, and we said goodnight. 6 months before the morning I stood on Ryan's porch. Callie called me at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. I was reading a habit I have maintained since Ellen died, because the house on Carver Street is very quiet after 9, and reading is better than the alternative. The call came from her regular number. When I answered, there was a pause before she spoke. The kind of pause that is not technical, but personal. She said she just wanted to hear my voice. I asked her if something had happened. She said no. I asked her if she was all right. She said yes. I asked her if she wanted me to come over. She said no. It was late. She was fine. She just wanted to talk for a minute. We talked for 11 minutes. I know because I looked at the call log afterward. She told me about a project at work, about a restaurant she and Ryan had tried, about nothing that mattered. Her voice was steady throughout. When we said goodnight, I put the phone down on the side table and looked at the page I had been reading. I did not pick the book back up. I sat for a while and thought about whether I should have pushed harder, whether I should have gotten in the car anyway, whether the 11 minutes of ordinary conversation were a performance or the truth. I decided it was the truth. I went to bed. I've had 6 months to think about that decision. 6 months of replaying the 11-minute call, of cataloging what I heard and what I chose to believe. 31 years of investigation teaches you pattern recognition. It does not teach you to apply it to your own daughter at 11 o'clock at night when her voice is steady and she says she is fine. That is a different kind of knowledge, and I did not have it then. I am not certain I have it fully now. What I know is that when my phone rang at 3:07 in the morning and I heard her voice say, "Dad," not the steady voice from 6 months ago, but something smaller and more careful than that, I did not wait to think about it. I was already reaching for my keys before she finished the sentence. 3 months before that night, my phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing a claim file I'd agreed to consult on. Retired doesn't mean entirely retired, not when the work is what you know. The number was Margaret O'Sea's. I had her in my contacts because she'd called twice in the past year to let me know when Callie's car was in the driveway and the lights were on. Small confirmations she offered without my asking because she understood, the way good neighbors do, that a father who lives 20 minutes away still needs to know his daughter is home safe. I picked up on the second ring. Margaret said she'd seen Callie twice in the past week and that both times something was wrong. She didn't say it like a question. She said it the way a person says something they've been turning over long enough to be certain of it. She told me Callie had been walking slowly, not tired slowly, but carefully, like someone managing discomfort they didn't want visible. She said the second time, a Thursday morning, Callie had been at the mailbox and Margaret had waved from her front porch, and Callie had waved back and pulled her sleeve down over her wrist as she did it. There was bruising, Margaret said, on her left wrist. She covered it before I could see the full shape of it, but I saw enough. She paused. "Raymond, I've been a nurse for 28 years. I know what a person looks like when they're not okay. Callie is not okay." I thanked her. I wrote down the date, the time, 2:14 p.m., and what she had said, word for word, in the small notebook I keep in the left drawer of my desk. I had kept notebooks like that for 31 years. Old habit, the kind that stays useful. I drove to Callie's house that Saturday without calling ahead. It was the first time I had done that. Every visit before had been arranged in advance, a text, a confirmation, a time agreed upon. I had told myself that was respect for her space, for her marriage, for the life she was building with Ryan. Sitting in my car outside their house that Saturday morning, I understood that I had also been telling myself something else, that if I called ahead, everything would be in order when I arrived, and I would not have to see what was actually there. Ryan answered the door. He was in a collared shirt, unhurried, and he smiled the way he always smiled, practiced and even, the kind of smile that takes effort to sustain but doesn't look like it. He said it was good to see me. He did not open the door wider. I said I was in the neighborhood and wanted to say hello to Callie. He said, "Of course, come in." and stepped back, just enough. Callie appeared from the hallway. She was wearing a long-sleeve shirt. She smiled when she saw me, and I watched the smile, not because I was looking for something wrong, but because I had been watching Callie's face since she was 3 days old, and I knew its rhythms. The smile arrived 2 seconds after her eyes registered me. That gap was not there before. She said, "Dad, I didn't know you were coming." I said I was sorry for not calling. She said it was fine. Ryan stayed in the room the entire 20 minutes I was there. He refilled his coffee once, checked his phone once, and contributed to the conversation at regular intervals, not constantly, not intrusively, but consistently enough that there was never a moment when Callie and I were simply talking without him present. I noticed it the way I used to notice things in interviews, the pattern beneath the surface, the thing that would be invisible if you weren't trained to look for it. When I stood to leave, Callie walked me to the door. On the porch, she took my hand for a moment before letting go. Her grip tightened 3 times. Not a squeeze. 3 distinct presses, deliberate and brief. I said I'd call her that week. She said, okay. Ryan appeared in the doorway behind her and said it was good to see me, same as before. I said the same. I sat in my car for 4 minutes before I started the engine. 2 weeks after that visit, Margaret called again. It was a Thursday evening, just past 8. She said she needed to tell me something and that she wanted to be precise about it, because she knew I would want the details exact. I told her to go ahead. She said that the previous night, at 11:47 p.m., she had been in her kitchen getting a glass of water and had looked out of the window. She looks out of that window automatically, she said, the way you do when you've lived somewhere long enough that the view becomes part of your peripheral awareness. And she had noticed that the red indicator light on the security camera mounted above Ryan and Callie's front gate was off. She knew that light. She had been seeing it from her kitchen window for 2 years, a small steady red point in the dark. It was not there. She had looked for 30 seconds to be certain, then gone to get her phone and photographed the camera housing from her window. The timestamp on the photo read 11:47 p.m. She sent it to me as we spoke. I looked at the image. The camera housing was visible, mounted on its bracket above the gatepost. The indicator light was dark. I asked her if she had seen Ryan outside near the gate that evening. She said she hadn't seen him, but that the light had been on when she'd made tea around 9 and off when she came back at 11:45. I thanked her. I told her the photograph was helpful. I asked her to keep it, not to delete it, and to send me the original file if she was able. She said she already had. The camera was off, that was the detail. In 31 years of insurance investigation, I had learned that people disable cameras for 2 reasons. They don't want a record of what's about to happen, or they don't want a record of what already has. Paper doesn't lie, and neither does the absence of paper, if you know what to look for. The timestamp was 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. I wrote it in the notebook. Then I called Diane Cho. Diane had been my attorney for 9 years, first for the estate work after my wife passed, then for other matters that required someone methodical and unhurried. I told her what Margaret had told me, and what I had observed during my visit, and what Callie's grip on my hand had felt like. I did not editorialize. I gave her the sequence. Diane listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always valued about her. When I finished, she said, "You're not there yet, Raymond. But you're getting there. Keep the notebook current. If there's a medical history we should know about, now is the time to think about who has access to it." I said I understood. She said she'd be available when I was ready to move. I told her I'd be in touch. I kept the notebook current. Every call from Margaret, every brief text from Callie, every detail that didn't fit the ordinary pattern of a daughter living her life, I wrote it down with the date and the time and the source. 31 years of investigation teaches you that a single anomaly is noise, 2 is a question, and 3 is a pattern that will hold up when someone asks you later to account for how you knew. I was already at 3. I was working towards something more durable than that. 1 month before that night, Callie came to my house alone. It was a Sunday afternoon, unannounced, which surprised me because she had not been the one to arrive unannounced in a long time. I opened the door, and she was standing on the porch with her keys still in her hand. like she hadn't fully decided whether she was staying. I told her to come in. I made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table where she had sat for her entire childhood, in the chair closest to the window, and she talked about her work, a project she was managing, a colleague she found difficult, ordinary things. I listened. I did not steer the conversation. I had learned, in the years since her mother died, that Callie needed to find her own way to what she had come to say, and that the fastest way to lose her was to ask directly before she was ready. She was thinner than the last time I'd seen her, not dramatically, not the kind of thin that announces itself, but the kind that accumulates quietly and is visible only to someone who has been watching for a long time. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and kept them there. When she stood to leave, I asked if she was okay. She said yes. I asked if there was anything she wanted to tell me. She looked down at the empty mug for a moment. Then she said, "You always ask that." I said I knew. I said I would keep asking. She picked up her keys from the counter. At the door, she turned and looked at me for a moment without saying anything, then went to her car. I stood in the doorway and watched until her taillights disappeared at the corner. She left without looking back. I went inside and updated the notebook. Then I sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the lights on and the coffee cooling in the pot, and I thought about the 3 presses of her hand and the 2-second delay in her smile, and the camera light that had been on at 9 and off at midnight, and the sleeve pulled down over her wrist on a warm Thursday morning. I thought about what Diane had said you're getting there, and I thought about how far I still had to go before I could do something that would hold. I did not rush it. Rushing was how you lost. My phone sat on the table beside the notebook. I looked at her name in my contacts for a moment, then put the phone face down and went to get my coat. I had a file to review. I would be ready when she called. Ryan Mercer filed the amended joint account paperwork on a Monday. I know it was a Monday because Diane called me that afternoon while I was driving back from the county records office, and I had to pull over on Elmwood to take the note. He had added his name to the secondary savings account Callie had held since she was 19, the one I had helped her open the summer before her first year of college, with $400 she had earned waitressing at the Lakeview Grill. The account had grown over 10 years. It was not a large amount by some measures, but it was hers in the particular way that first money is always yours earned before anyone else had a claim on your time. Diane read me the filing number. I wrote it down. I thanked her and sat in the car for a moment with the engine running and the notebook open on the passenger seat. I had been a claims investigator for 31 years. In that time, I had watched people do things to other people's assets that most families never imagined possible. I had watched it happen slowly, in increments small enough that no single step looked like theft. That was the method, always the method. You moved one account, you changed one address, you redirected one automatic deposit. Each step was explainable on its own. Taken together, they told a story that only made sense once you laid them all out flat on a table and read them in order. I had been laying them out for weeks. I was not surprised by the savings account. I had been waiting for something like it. What I had not been waiting for was the call from Dr. Elaine Marsh. She had been Callie's physician since Callie was 7 years old, since the November when my wife and I had brought her in for a persistent ear infection, and Elaine had been the on-call doctor who had stayed an extra hour to make sure the antibiotic was working. She had seen Callie through every well visit and school physical for 22 years. She had been at my wife's memorial. She was not a woman who called unnecessarily. She called on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after the savings account filing. She said she needed to speak with me in person, not on the phone. I asked if Callie was all right. She said, "I'd like to speak with you in person." Raymond. I told her I could be there in 40 minutes. She said she'd leave the side door unlocked. Her office was in a low brick building on Clearwater Avenue that had housed 3 different medical practices in the 30 years I'd known it. The waiting room was empty when I arrived. She had scheduled the conversation after her last appointment of the day. She was sitting behind her desk with a manila folder in front of her, and she stood when I came in and shook my hand the way she always had, firmly and without ceremony. She told me that Callie had come in 6 weeks ago for what was listed on the intake form as a routine check, that it had not been routine, that during the examination she had documented several things she was now prepared to share with me under the applicable reporting provisions, with Callie's written consent, which she had obtained that morning by phone. She opened the folder. She did not hand it to me immediately. She said, "Before I show you this, I want you to know that Callie came in alone. She drove herself. She asked me not to call you at the time." She paused. "She's changed her mind about that." She handed me the folder. "I have reviewed thousands of documents in my career. I have read accident reports and autopsy summaries and fraud affidavits and contested wills. I am not a man who reacts to paper. I read the first page, then the second, then went back to the first." I set the folder on my knee. The fluorescent light above Elaine's desk made a faint, even hum that I had not noticed until that moment. I counted the sound for several seconds before I spoke. I asked her what the applicable reporting provisions meant in practical terms. She told me. I asked if she had already filed. She said not yet. She had wanted to speak with me first, and with Diane Cho, whose name Callie had provided. I told her that was the right sequence. She nodded. She had a glass of water on her desk, and she moved it 1 inch to the left without seeming to notice she had done it. I recognized that gesture. It was the same thing I did with my coffee cup when I was holding something in. I asked if Callie was safe right now. Elaine said she believed so, for now, but that her professional assessment was that the situation had a trajectory. She used that word, trajectory. I wrote it down in the notebook. Then I asked Elaine if she would be willing to provide a formal statement and appear if necessary. She said, "Raymond, I've known that child since she was 7 years old. She did not need to say anything else." I drove to Diane's office directly from Clearwater Avenue. It was after 6 by the time I arrived, but Diane was still at her desk. She had been expecting me because Elaine had called ahead. Diane had the trust documents spread across the conference table alongside the amended account filing and the 3 photographs Margaret had taken from across the street in the preceding weeks. She had added Elaine's preliminary notes, printed on her own letterhead, to the right side of the row. Diane said, "We're ready to file for the emergency protective order." I stood at the end of the table and looked at the documents laid out in sequence. 31 years of reading fraud cases had trained me to look for the shape of a thing before I looked at its details, and the shape of what was on that table was clear. Each piece alone could be dismissed. Together, they described a man who had been moving systematically and who had not yet finished moving. I asked Diane how long the filing would take. She said she could have it in front of Judge Patricia Wren by Thursday morning if I authorized her to proceed tonight. I told her to proceed. She picked up her pen. I watched her initial the first page. Then my phone rang. The number was Callie's. It was 6:47 in the evening, not not the middle of the night, just an ordinary Wednesday evening in October. I picked up. She said, "Dad," the same way she had said it the last time, but different. There was something steadier underneath it now, as though she had made a decision before dialing and was holding on to it. I said, "I'm here." She said she needed me to come. She said Ryan was at a client dinner until 9 and that she had maybe 2 hours. She said she had found something and she didn't know what to do with it. I asked her what she had found. She said she would show me when I got there. Then she said, and I wrote this down later, exactly as she said it, "Dad, don't tell him you're coming, please." I looked at Diane across the table. Diane was already standing, already reaching for her coat. I told Callie I would be there in 30 minutes. I told her to lock the interior door of the bedroom if she felt she needed to, and to call me if anything changed before I arrived. She said, "Okay." She said it quietly, the way people say, "Okay," when they are concentrating on staying calm. I drove. The route to their house on Birchfield Lane was 26 minutes without traffic. I took it in 24. I did not run any lights. I have learned that rushing is how you make mistakes, and I could not afford mistakes that night. I went over the sequence in my head as I drove the account filing, the photographs, Elaine's folder, the documents on Diane's table, and I thought about trajectories, and about the particular patience required to wait until a thing was complete before you moved against it. I was not there yet, but I was close. I pulled onto Birchfield Lane at 7:19. The house was lit from inside the kitchen window, the front room, the upstairs bedroom where I knew Callie spent most of her evenings because Margaret had noted it in her timestamps. I parked at the curb, 2 houses down, out of habit. I sat for a moment. The street was quiet. A dog was barking somewhere to the east. The temperature had dropped since sundown, and my breath showed faintly when I stepped out of the car. I walked to the front door and knocked. The porch light came on. I heard footsteps, not Callie's, heavier, and I understood in that half second that Ryan had come home early. The door opened. He was still in his work clothes, jacket on, tie loosened. He had a glass in his hand. He looked at me, the way a man looks at something that should not exist, not with anger, not with surprise exactly, but with a particular going still that I recognized from 31 years of sitting across tables from people who had just understood that someone knew. The color left his face in the space of 2 seconds, not all at once, the way a document fades when you hold it too long under a light. He said my name, just my name, nothing attached to it. I said, "Hello, Ryan, is Callie home?" He did not answer immediately. His hand tightened on the glass. I counted 3 seconds of silence. I did not fill them, and in those 3 seconds, I watched him run through whatever calculation a man runs through when he opens a door and finds the one person he was not prepared for. He had been at a client dinner. He had come home early. He had not known I was coming. And something in the fact of my standing there, on that porch, on that particular Wednesday evening, had told him something he had not wanted to know. Callie appeared behind him in the hallway. She had her arms crossed and her face was very still. She looked at me, and then at Ryan's back, and then at me again. I gave her one small nod. She held on to it. Ryan stepped back from the door. He did not invite me in, he simply moved, the way a man moves when he has run out of the option to not move. I stepped inside. Ryan closed the door behind me. The sound it made was very quiet. The house smelled like dinner that had been cleared away too quickly, something with garlic, and underneath it, the faint chemical sweetness of the plug-in air fresheners Callie had never used before she married him. I had noticed them the last time I was here, 8 months ago. There were 4 of them now. I counted them the way I count things when I need to stay still. Ryan had recovered some of his composure by the time he turned around. That was the thing about him, he was fast. 23 years of interviewing claimants had taught me to watch for the speed of a man's recovery, because it tells you more than the initial reaction ever does. His color had come back. His jaw had reset. He had already decided. In the 4 seconds it took to close the door, what version of himself he was going to present. "Raymond," he said, "this is unexpected." I said, "I know." He looked at Callie. She was still standing in the hallway, still with her arms crossed, still very quiet. Ryan's eyes moved from her face to mine and then back again, doing the arithmetic. He said, "Is everything all right?" I said, "We'll see." That was when Callie's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She went to it, read the screen, and said, "They're here." Ryan said, "Who's here?" Neither of us answered him. The doorbell rang 40 seconds later. Ryan stood in the center of his own living room and watched me walk past him to open his front door. I think that was the moment he understood that something had already happened. Not something that was about to happen, but something completed, something that had been set in motion weeks ago and had arrived at his house the same way I had, quietly and on a Wednesday, without announcement. Detective Sandra Pruitt was on the porch. She had her badge on her hip and a woman I recognized standing just behind her doctor. Elaine Marsh, Callie's physician since Callie was 7 years old, carrying a manila folder under one arm. Behind them on the front walk, Thomas, my brother, stood with his hands in his jacket pockets. He had driven up from Crestview that afternoon. He gave me a single nod, the same kind I had given Callie. Ryan said, "What is this?" It was not a question. It had the flat register of a man who already knows the answer and is buying seconds. Detective Pruitt introduced herself. She had a calm, unhurried voice, the kind that comes from years of delivering information in rooms where people do not want to receive it. She told Ryan she had some questions for him and that she'd appreciate it if they could sit down. Ryan said he wanted to call his attorney. Pruitt said that was entirely his right and she would wait. Ryan called. His attorney, a man named Garrett who I had looked up 3 weeks ago, said he would be there in 20 minutes. Ryan told him to make it 15. We sat in the living room. Ryan sat on the edge of the couch with his phone in his hand. Callie sat in the chair by the window, the one that faced the street. I sat across from Ryan. Thomas stood near the doorway to the kitchen. Dr. Marsh sat in the second chair and set her folder on her knee. Pruitt stood. Nobody spoke for a while. Ryan looked at the folder on Dr. Marsh's knee twice. The second time, he looked away faster than the first. Garrett arrived in 18 minutes. He was younger than I expected, mid-40s, dark suit, the slightly too deliberate confidence of a man who had been called in from dinner and was working to project that it didn't matter. He shook Ryan's hand, assessed the room in one sweep, and said, "Before anyone says anything, I'd like a moment with my client." Pruitt said, "Of course." They stepped into the kitchen. Thomas and I could hear the low rhythm of Garrett's voice, but not the words. Ryan said something once, sharply, and then went quiet again. When they came back, Garrett sat beside Ryan on the couch and put a legal pad on his knee. Pruitt began. She was methodical and unhurried, and she had done this before. She asked Ryan about the period between January and September of the current year. She asked about Callie's medical appointments, specifically, which ones Ryan had driven her to, and which ones he had not. Ryan said he supported Callie's health care fully. Pruitt said she was sure he did, and asked again about the specific appointments. That was when Dr. Marsh opened her folder. Elaine Marsh had been Callie's doctor for 22 years. She had Callie's records going back to childhood, every appointment, every prescription, every referral. She had also, at my request, and with Callie's written consent, compiled a second document, a comparative timeline, Callie's appointment frequency before the marriage, Callie's appointment frequency in the 31 months since, the referrals that had been made and not followed up on, the prescriptions that had been filled once and not renewed, the 2 specialist visits that Ryan had scheduled, driven her to, and sat inside the examination room for both times, against standard practice, because Callie had told the front desk that her husband needed to be present to help her remember the information. Dr. Marsh set the comparative timeline on the coffee table and turned it so that Detective Pruitt could read it. She said, "I want to note for the record that I have Callie's signed consent to share all of this, and that I submitted a copy to your department this morning." Pruitt said, "I have it." Garrett leaned forward and looked at the document. His expression did not change, but he stopped writing on his legal pad. Ryan said, "Elaine, this is completely out of context." "Doctor," Marsh said, "My name is Dr. Marsh." She said it pleasantly. She had been a physician for 26 years. She was not confused, and she was not interested in being on a first-name basis with him. "And I'd like to finish, if you don't mind." Ryan looked at Garrett. Garrett said nothing. "Doctor," Marsh continued. She walked through the timeline in the same unhurried way that Pruitt had asked her questions, not dramatically, not with heat, just with the particular precision of a person who has organized facts and intends to present them in order. She noted that Callie had lost 14 pounds between the previous October and the current April without any documented medical reason. She noted that Callie's reported sleep disturbance had increased across 3 separate appointments. She noted that at the most recent visit, 6 weeks ago, Callie had presented with bruising on her left forearm that she had attributed to a fall. Dr. Marsh said she had documented the bruising at the time. She said the pattern was not consistent with a fall. The room was very quiet. Ryan said, "That is, she did fall. She told you she fell. I was there." "Doctor," Marsh said, "you were in the waiting room for that appointment. Mr. Mercer." Ryan said, "I was," and stopped. Pruitt said, "Mr. Mercer, I'm going to ask you directly. In the past 18 months, have you at any point physically restrained your wife, prevented her from leaving your home, or controlled her access to her phone, her finances, or her medical care. Garrett put his hand on Ryan's arm. Ryan said, I want to be very clear that I love my wife, and I have never. Pruitt said, I'd like a yes or no, please. Garrett said, my client will not be answering that question tonight. Pruitt nodded. She had expected this. She reached into the folder she had brought and set 2 photographs on the coffee table beside Dr. Marsh's timeline. The photographs were time-stamped. They had been taken by Margaret Osei's front door camera across the street over a period of 4 months. In the first, Ryan was visible in the driveway, standing beside Callie's car, and Callie was visible in the doorway of the house. The timestamp read 7:14 a.m. on a Thursday in March. Callie had had a job interview that morning. I knew because she had told me about it 2 weeks before, and then called me afterward to say she hadn't been able to go. She had said her car wouldn't start. In the photograph, her car was in the driveway. Ryan was standing next to it. In the second photograph, taken 11 seconds later by the same camera, Ryan was walking back toward the house, and Callie was no longer in the doorway. She had missed 4 job interviews in 6 months. I had not known about any of them until Callie told me, on the phone, at 3 in the morning, 5 days ago. Ryan looked at the photographs for a long time. Then he looked at Callie. She was still in the chair by the window. She had not moved, and she had not spoken since Detective Pruitt arrived. She was looking at the photographs on the coffee table with the expression of someone who has known something for a very long time and has only just allowed themselves to see it clearly. Ryan said, Callie, you know what those look like isn't what they are. Callie said, I know what they are. It was the first thing she had said in 40 minutes. Her voice was steady. I had not been sure it would be, but it was. Garrett leaned over and spoke quietly to Ryan. Ryan listened, and some of the color left his face again, not all at once, the way it had when he opened the door and found me standing on his porch, but slowly, in the way that happens when a man begins to understand the full perimeter of what he is standing inside. Pruitt said she was going to need Ryan to come to the station with her to continue the conversation. Garrett said he would accompany him. Ryan stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at me once not with anger, which I had expected, but with something closer to the expression of a man who has just understood, too late, what kind of opponent he was dealing with. He had thought I was a retired man with a file folder and a grudge. He had been wrong about the file folder. He had been wrong about the retirement. And he had been catastrophically wrong about the patients. I did not say anything. I have learned that silence at the right moment is not a gap, it is a weight. I let it rest on him. Thomas walked them to the door. As Ryan stepped onto the porch, Margaret Osei was standing on her own front steps across the street, her arms folded against the night air, watching. She had been the one to compile the camera footage, 6 weeks of it, organized by date and timestamp, transferred to a drive that she had handed to me personally at her kitchen table. She had been a nurse for 28 years. She knew what she was looking at when she reviewed those files, and she had not hesitated for a single day. Ryan saw her. She did not look away. Garrett guided Ryan to the detective's car. Pruitt spoke briefly with Thomas on the porch, handed him a card, and told him to call if Callie needed anything that evening. Thomas said he would. The car pulled away from the curb and moved down the street, and then it turned the corner and was gone. I stood in the doorway. The night air was cool and smelled like cut grass from somewhere down the block. Behind me, I heard Callie exhale a long, uneven sound, the kind that has been held too long. I heard the chair creak as she finally let herself lean back into it. I heard Dr. Marsh say her name, very quietly, and I heard Callie say, I'm okay. And then, after a pause, I think I'm okay. I stayed in the doorway for another moment. Across the street, Margaret Osei went back inside and closed her front door. The porch light stayed on. I turned around and went back in. The emergency protective order had been signed by Judge Wren at 4:17 in the morning. Detective Pruitt filed the accompanying documentation before sunrise. By the time most of Callie's neighbors were making coffee and checking their phones, Ryan Mercer had been formally served at the Marriott on Claremont Avenue, where he had apparently checked in sometime after leaving the house. The officer who served him, a young patrolman named Des Carter, according to what Detective Pruitt told me later, said Ryan had answered the door in his dress shirt and slacks, as though he hadn't slept either, or hadn't tried. He signed the acknowledgement of service without saying anything. Des Carter noted that in his report, "I know these details because Detective Pruitt called me at 8:40 that morning. I was sitting at Callie's kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and I answered on the second ring. She told me the service had been completed, that Ryan's access to the property was formally restricted, and that the next step would be a hearing within 14 days. She said Diane Cho had already been in contact with the court clerk's office. I thanked her. She said, 'Your daughter has good documentation. Mr. Holt, that matters.' I told her I knew. She said she hoped Callie would get some rest. I said I hoped so too." I set the phone down and looked at the cold coffee. Then I drank it anyway. Callie slept until almost noon. Dr. Marsh had stayed until nearly 5 in the morning. She had a practice to open, patients scheduled, a day that would not accommodate what she had just witnessed, but she left her personal cell number written on a notepad on the kitchen counter, next to a note that said, "Call me when she wakes up." I mean it. I kept the note where it was. Thomas arrived around 10. He drove 2 hours without me asking him to. I had sent him a single text at 7 in the morning that said only Callie's safe. She's at her house. I'm here. He showed up with a bag of groceries and a thermos of actual hot coffee because Thomas has always understood that the practical thing is also the kind thing. He walked in, looked at me, looked at the house, and said, "Tell me what needs doing." I told him the locks needed to be changed before Callie woke up. He said he'd handle it. By 11:30, every exterior lock in the house had been replaced. He kept the new keys in a small envelope on the kitchen counter and didn't make any kind of announcement about it. When Callie came downstairs, she was wearing an old sweatshirt I recognized from years ago, her college roommate's. She'd kept it so long it had become hers. Her hair was pulled back. She looked at Thomas, and for a moment, she didn't say anything. And then she crossed the kitchen and hugged him, and he held on and didn't say anything either. That was the right call. I've watched Thomas make the right call in moments like that my whole life, and I am still grateful for it. She sat down at the kitchen table. Thomas made eggs. I poured her coffee. She looked at the notepad from Dr. Marsh and picked it up and held it for a moment without reading it. Then she set it back down and said, "What happens now?" I told her what Detective Pruitt had told me. The protective order, the 14-day hearing, the documentation. I told her Diane Cho was already on it. I did not tell her everything I knew about how long that documentation had been building the calls to Diane going back 4 months, the notes I had kept, the conversation with Dr. Marsh that had started 6 weeks ago. There would be time for that. What she needed right then was not the architecture of what had happened. She needed eggs and coffee and her uncle making noise in the kitchen and the knowledge that the locks were changed. She listened. She nodded once or twice. Then she said, "I kept thinking I was overreacting." She was looking at the table when she said it, not at me. He always said I was overreacting, and I kept trying to figure out if he was right. I didn't answer immediately. I've learned that silence makes room for the sentence that actually matters. She said, "The phone. Last night. I didn't know if it was too late to call." I told her it was never too late to call. She looked up. I said it again. Never. She nodded. And this time, the nod was different, slower, like something settling. Thomas put a plate in front of her and said, "Eat first. Fall apart later if you need to. That's the order of operations." She almost laughed. It was small and brief, but it was there. The 14-day hearing took place on a Thursday morning in Judge Wren's courtroom. Ryan appeared with an attorney I didn't recognize, not the one who had been involved in the earlier financial discussions. A different one, younger, who looked like he had been retained quickly and had not had enough time to prepare. Ryan wore a suit. He sat very straight. He looked, for most of the proceeding, like a man who still believed that presentation could substitute for position. It cannot. Diane had submitted 43 pages of documentation. Dr. Marsh testified for 11 minutes. Detective Pruitt submitted her incident report and was present in the gallery. Margaret Osei had provided a written statement that Diane had entered into the record 2 days prior. Judge Wren extended the protective order for 1 year and referred the matter for further review. She said very little beyond what was required. At one point, she looked at Ryan's attorney and said, "Counsel, I want to be sure your client understands the scope of these restrictions." Ryan's attorney said yes. Judge Wren said, "Make sure." She did not look at Ryan when she said it. She was already writing. Ryan did not speak to me when we left the courtroom. He walked out ahead of his attorney, through the side door, and I did not see him again that day. His attorney paused in the hallway and looked at Diane, then at me, and then left without saying anything. Some conversations don't need words to be complete. Callie stood in the corridor outside the courtroom for a long time after it was over. She had her arms crossed, not defensively, more like she was holding herself together while she got used to the weight of what had just happened. I stood nearby and let her take whatever time she needed. After a while, she said, "Is it always this quiet afterward?" I told her that in my experience, yes. The loud part is over, and then it's just quiet. She said, "I thought I'd feel more." I told her that sometimes it comes later, and sometimes what feels like nothing is actually relief, and the two are hard to tell apart at first. She thought about that. Then she said, "Okay." Just that. "Okay." We walked out of the building together. The morning was overcast, the kind of gray that isn't threatening, just even. Diane shook Callie's hand at the bottom of the steps and told her she'd be in touch about next steps. Callie thanked her. Diane looked at me and gave a small nod, the kind that means this is done. And it was done right, and then she walked to her car. Thomas was waiting in the parking lot. He had driven separately and he had brought sandwiches. Because Thomas always brings food, and I have never once complained about it. We sat in his car for a while and ate and didn't talk much. Callie ate half of hers and stared out the window. At one point, she said, quietly, "I called you at 3 in the morning and told you not to tell him you were coming." She paused. "You came anyway." I told her that was the only part of the plan that had ever been certain. She didn't say anything else for a while. Neither did I. Ryan Mercer vacated the house on Delwood Street 11 days later. He moved into an apartment across town. I know this only because the property management process required a forwarding address for the utility transfers, and Diane's office handled the paperwork. He did not take much. Callie told me later that she had expected it to feel like more of an ending, but it mostly just felt like the house getting quieter and then slowly becoming hers again. She repainted the living room in October, a color called pale ash, which I thought sounded like a bad omen, but which turned out to look very good in afternoon light. Margaret Osei brought over a casserole the week after the hearing. She and Callie sat on the porch for almost 2 hours. I wasn't there for that, but Callie told me about it afterward that Margaret had said, without any particular drama. "Your father came the night I called him too. Years ago, when my husband was sick. He sat on that porch until morning." I hadn't remembered that. Or rather, I had remembered it differently as something small, unremarkable, the kind of thing you do because someone needs a person nearby. Callie said she'd thought about that for a long time after Margaret went home. I told her I was glad Margaret had said it. I meant that. I drove home that evening on the route I've taken for 31 years, past the hardware store that used to be a pharmacy, past the park where I taught Callie to ride a bike on a Saturday morning in April, past the turn that leads to the cemetery where my wife has been buried for 9 years. I didn't stop. I don't always stop, but I slowed down at the turn, the way I always do, and for a moment, the evening light came through the trees at a low angle and made everything look like it was from a long time ago. I got home. I made coffee. I sat in the kitchen and drank it while it was still hot. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when they have been lived in a long time and most of the noise has already happened. I looked at the phone on the counter, the same phone that had rung at 3:04 in the morning, the same number, My daughter's voice saying, "Dad, don't tell him you're coming." I thought about that for a moment. Then I got up, washed the cup, and went to bed.